Have you ever watched a video and thought, this feels like it's from a movie? Or conversely, watched a video and thought, why does this feel so choppy and like stop motion-y? Well, that comes down to the frame rate of the video. So today we're talking about how to choose the right frame rate for your project. Whether you're filming a YouTube vlog or a cinematic short or really anything in between, let's dive into it. First off, what is a frame rate? Frame rate is the number of frames or images that your camera captures. It's measured in frames per second, or you'll see it abbreviated as FPS. And a good rule of thumb is the higher the number, the smoother the motion. So think of it like a flip book. The faster you flip, the smoother everything looks, right? That's exactly what frame rate does for your video. Back in the day when they were just inventing moving pictures, they did a study on how fast the human brain could process information. They basically wanted to see what the optimal number of frames per second was, and that's where they landed on 24. That's pretty much the maximum number of frames that your brain can see in 1 second and process all of that information. So we're gonna dive into 24 frames per second in just a minute. Now let's break down the most common frame rates and what they're used for. We're gonna start from the least and go into the most. First up, 10 frames per second, and this is way below the standard 24 frames per second, obviously. You wouldn't use this frame rate typically for normal video content, but here are 4 reasons why you might choose 10 frames per second. First is stylized effects. That's to intentionally give your footage a stop motion type of look, or kind of like a vintage camcorder vibe. Love it. Second is for time lapses. This is for when you don't need real-time smooth motion and you know you're gonna adjust the playback and post-production anyway. Third is for GIFs and animations. So this is where the file size needs to be small and full motion isn't really necessary. If you haven't had to dabble in GIFs yet, you probably don't know this, but GIF files can get huge really quickly. And so frame rate is one of those things that you will just cut first and foremost so that you can cut down on that file size. The last one is for low bandwidth previews, like when cameras or software will use it for playback or thumbnails. All right, let's hop up to 24 frames per second or 2398. I'm gonna mush those in together and we'll talk about what the difference is. So 24 frames per second is the cinematic standard. It gives that classic filmy motion blur that all the film bros just salivate over. So if you want your project to feel like a film, 24 frames per second is gonna be your bread and butter. Now you may be asking yourself, is there really a difference between 24 frames per second and 23.98 frames per second? Yes, there is. I'm gonna dive into it. It's gonna get a little techie, so bear with me. And it seems insignificant, but really picking the wrong one for your project can give you some grief. So it's better to know what you need going into it than choosing the wrong frame rate for your whole project. So if you're shooting film, actual film, not a film, like you're loading film, and or you want your project to distribute into theaters, you want to use 24 frames per second. So film cameras are traditionally set for 24 frames per second, and that's the frame rate that's standard for theatrical releases and distributing in theaters. Conversely, 2398 is the standard frame rate for television distribution, plus it's the frame rate that will more easily sync with audio, and that's where it gets super techie. That has to do with the hertz levels of the audio gear. You just need to know that it's easier to sync with audio. Next up, 30 frames per second. This is most common for social media. It's a bit smoother and almost more lifelike than 24 frames per second, but it still has that natural look. You don't really get as much of a motion blur. It does look just a little bit more crispy. In my opinion, it kind of has a little bit more of a digital look, but honestly, most people won't notice a difference. And then there's 60 frames per second. This is usually used for gaming, sports, and any kind of fast action. Personally, I feel like I can always tell when something's shot at 60 frames per second, but I'm watching it in a 24 or 30 timeline. It kind of looks hyper realistic, almost like HDR, but it's not HDR. And then 60 frames per second is really good if you want to do slow motion in post. Most phones will have a 60 frame per second option, and a lot of times I see influencers recommending everybody record at 60 frames per second all the time. And it's kind of for no reason. I don't think they really know what they're talking about. If you like the look, go for it, but it's not necessary in your everyday. And it really will just cause you to take up a lot more space in your camera roll. Because when you think about it, you're shooting double what you typically would shoot at 30 frames per second. All right, last up is 120 or 240 frames per second, and this is for ultra slow motion. There are cameras that go way past 240 frames per second, and those are really fun to play with. So you shoot it at 120 or 240 frames per second, but then when you put it into your editing software, you encode it to play it back at 24 or 30 frames per second, depending on your project. How gorgeous is that, you know? Now you're probably asking yourself, okay, but which one do I use? Which one? There's a lot of options. So if you're not sure what frame rate you should use, ask yourself these 3 questions. Number 1, what kind of project is this? If it's a vlog, go 30. A short film, 24. An action montage, or you're going for an emotional flashback, you're gonna wanna go for 60, 120, or 240, maybe even higher. Second question, where will it be shown? Now, it's good to get in the habit of looking at delivery specs for platforms that you're going to be distributing your stuff on. So at the time of making this video, Instagram and Facebook have a minimum of 30 frames per second for their videos. TikTok, you can upload at multiple different frame rates, but the lowest is 2398. And then for YouTube, the lowest is 24. So you want to take that into consideration. And then the third question, do you need slow motion? If the answer is yes, then you have to shoot at a higher frame rate. You really don't have another option. So go for 60, 120, or 240. All right, let's get into what I personally do for all of my videos. I feel like I'm sliding down. Look, I know that looking at those delivery specs is really confusing. I like a more filmy look to my videos, and I'm pretty much always syncing to captured audio. Test, test. Hello. To be honest, I typically just export it 2398 and call it good. And here's why. All of these platforms will take your video and encode it to their minimum specs to then distribute. And I really don't have the time to encode a different frame rate for every single one of these platforms. But if you're concerned with the absolute best quality playback and you want to shoot in 2398 for that filmy look, this is what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to encode your 2398 footage for the minimum frame rate for each platform. So TikTok, you're fine because they support 2398. YouTube, you're gonna have to do 24, and then Instagram will have to be up to 30. It's a lot of work in my opinion, and the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Most people can't tell, and it really isn't gonna cause any huge issues with your playback. Seriously, most people won't be able to tell a difference in quality. Now let's get into pro tips and mistakes to avoid. Always match your timeline frame rate to the frame rate of the footage that you shot. So if you shot in 60 frames per second for that slow-mo look, you're gonna wanna encode that footage to match the 24 or 30 frames per second timeline. Otherwise, you might get jitters or weird glitches in the playback. Next, be intentional with the slow motion that you're shooting. So if you're recording in 60, 120, or 240, you have to think, like I mentioned before, you're shooting so much more data and you're gonna fill up your memory cards faster. So think to yourself, do I need this in slow motion? And do I have the memory cards to capture this content? Because if you typically shoot at 30 frames per second and you're shooting at 240, you're gonna fill up your memory cards 8 times faster. Me saying that so confidently, I'm literally double checking my math. 8 times faster. LOL. Okay, next, mixing frame rates can be done creatively, but I would caution you to be careful. Use a mixed frame rate timeline intentionally, use it for storytelling techniques, and basically just use it as a one-off. The majority of your footage should all be shot cohesively with little elements sprinkled in of the slow motion or of the stop motion or of a time lapse. So just be intentional with how you use these tools. Okay, last pro tip. You may not know this, but some cameras automatically adjust their frame rate for fluorescent lights. You want to match your frame rate to your region's power frequency. In the US, that's 60 hertz of power, which means that you want to use a 30 or 60 frame rate. In Europe, they use 50 hertz for their fluorescent lighting, so you're going to want to use 24 frames per second or 50 frames per second. A common mistake I see in regards to frame rates is this mentality of thinking that a higher frame rate equals better quality. Wrong. That's not true. The frame rate affects the motion feel, not necessarily the sharpness, the resolution. The quality has so much more to do with your sensor and your lighting than it does the actual frame rate. So choosing the right frame rate will support your story as opposed to like adding to the quality. I honestly am just like a hater of people saying to use 60 frames per second when they're shooting with their iPhone for no reason. If you're just doing like a get ready with me or whatever, like stop telling the girlies that they need to be shooting at 60 frames per second. They do not, I promise you. I'm a hater to my core. And there you have it. Now you know what frame rate to use for your next project. Whether you're going cinematic, casual, more action-packed, picking the right frame rate can totally affect how your project feels. Now, if this helped, if you feel like you learned something, give it a like, give a subscribe. Drop any questions that you have down below. I would love to answer them. I want this channel to be helpful to you, especially if you're newer to this industry, if you're students just starting out, trying to get your feet wet in production and content. I know how overwhelming it can be, especially with all like the tech film bros in the industry. If you're like a girly pop like me, it feels very intimidating. So I'm happy to help out, answer any questions that you have, and I will see you next time. Bye.